Since Peter became the absolute ruler of the realm, the Tsar was rarely ever seen in Moscow. He conducted maneuvers with his toy regiments, built wooden fortresses, and then captured them himself. Meanwhile, a whole heap of decrees had already piled up. Finally, the door burst open with a bang. Into the chamber burst the disheveled and grimy sovereign of all Russia. He grabbed a scroll at random. It read, "And since this is by no means possible, it is necessary to..." "Well then," he said, "let them decide for themselves what needs to be done. Woe to the country whose ruler is mad." What will become of the Russian Tsardom if the sovereign behaves like a child and, as if possessed, plays with toy soldiers? Many years will pass since then, and Peter the Great, ruler of all Russia, will reshape the entire state system and economy in order to create Russia's first professional army ever in all of history. And he will lead it into battle against the most powerful military force ever to be seen in Europe. Throughout history, the army has always remained the main guarantor of the country's security. The troops defended the borders. The troops suppressed rebellions and riots. The throne was supported by an army loyal to the Tsar, and the empire relied on the army.
The Russian army was very large, but it was also diverse in its composition. It was primarily composed of noble cavalry, streltsy infantry, and soldier regiments of the foreign formation. A nobleman, in exchange for military service, received a land grant, an estate, from the Tsar, and used its income to acquire horses, weapons, and equipment. At the first call, the noble cavalry would arrive at assembly points for military reviews or set out on campaigns. The backbone of the Russian infantry was formed by the streltsy. The streltsy underwent combat training, and they lived in separate settlements with their families. During peacetime, they performed guard duty, and they fought fires. Many ran shops, engaged in trade, or pursued other private businesses. In addition, a separate part was formed by the so-called regiments of foreign formation. Initially, they were based on foreign officers and soldiers, and they served as the Tsar's personal guard.
According to an old tradition, each Russian Tsarevich had a set of weapons and armor, as well as his own army that was recruited from boys of the same age, and it was called Poteshnoi, the toy regiment. But Peter Alexeyevich needed everything to be real, including uniforms, weapons, provisions, and even cannons, along with cannonballs and gunpowder, artillery masters, and experienced officers. By the year 1686, the young Tsar had at his disposal an extremely well-trained force, and this force was in no way at all inferior to a real army. It was the troops of the foreign formation that the young Tsar Peter took as a model for his army. He formed exactly 2 regiments from his toy troops, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky. And Peter himself drafted the military regulations for his regiments. Foreign teachers taught him both the German and Dutch languages, since all important military books were not written in Russian but in those languages, geometry, astronomy, as well as fortification. And his toy soldiers? They studied the same subjects. And then again, the drum, and again, firing practice, storming fortresses, and marching left, right. In just 10 short years, The former boys from the toy regiments would become the most combat-ready and professional military force in the whole of Russia. The army was in need of serious reforms. It was effective for war against old adversaries, the Crimean Khanate and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But Peter, well, he faced all sorts of problems that had but recently seemed insignificant. From Arkhangelsk to the Volga, foreign trading companies completely dominated Russia. The English, Dutch, Swedes, and Danes bought Russian goods for a mere pittance, exporting them to Europe on huge ships. The English Parliament held numerous hearings in an attempt to determine whether or not to turn the lands along the Volga into a British colony. At the court of Polish kings, it was discussed that Russia should become for Poland what the American colonies were for England, with many arguing in favor. Russia did not have a fleet, nor did it even have access to the seas. The Swedes, who had built fortresses all along the coast, blocked access to the Baltic, while from the south, Turkish bastions pressed against Moscow, blocking traders' access to the Black Sea. The Russian state, despite its vast expanses, could have turned from a great empire into a colony like those in Africa within just a few years. Peter made a decision. He would break through to the seas, no matter what the cost would be, to build ports and ships there, in order to create a navy. And the Tsar's main goal? It was to gain access to the Baltic. This meant war with the strongest army in all of Europe at that time. The forces of the Swedish king known as Charles XII. The Swedish king was just 15 years old. In Europe, they scoffed and thought he was incapable of anything. Behind his back, Charles was called a boy who was in over his head trying to fill his father's shoes. Peter formed a military alliance with both Poland and Denmark, and then he set about strengthening his army. He recruited soldiers and foreign officers. Sparing no expense, he purchased rifles, cannons, and ammunition. And finally, he made up his mind. To mark the beginning of the military campaign, they held a celebration. Peter couldn't take his eyes off Anna Mons. His beloved was more beautiful than she had ever been before. Toasts followed one after another. To His Majesty, to each general individually, to the artillery and infantry, and to the allies. The Tsar's orderly, Alexashka Menshikov, appeared clanking with tin buckets on his feet. He was imitating Charles in his boots. He climbed onto the table, and the guests, breathless with laughter, threw at him whatever they could get their hands on. Peter was good-naturedly having fun along with the guests. He did not yet know at the time that young Charles of Sweden had swiftly and easily knocked both the Polish and Danish kings out of the war completely, but he soon learned. Russia was left without any allies at all. In September 1700, the vanguard of the Russian army approached the Swedish fortress of Narva. Meanwhile, intelligence reported to Peter. King Charles was already on his way with reinforcements. The Tsar hurriedly left for Novgorod in order to quickly organize the transfer of lagging troops and artillery. By all calculations, there was only a week left until the imminent arrival of the enemy army. The soldiers who were besieging Narva were all impatiently waiting for the real action to finally begin, the big battle. And until the Tsar, Peter, would finally arrive with both reserves and cannons, they could pass the time with a mock battle. And then, all of the jokes came to an end. The calculations on which the sovereign relied turned out to be wrong. Charles of Sweden appeared at the walls of Narva earlier than expected and unleashed the full might of his army on the Russian regiments. Captain Mikhailo Golitsyn realized, this is the end. Close ranks! The Swedish infantry attack broke through the front in 3 places at once, and the Russians fled in disarray. The mercenary officers immediately surrendered, and some were killed by their own soldiers. Peter was in Novgorod at this time. He did not see how his army was perishing in the snowy whirlwind, how the recruits in Streltsy, maddened with terror, were rushing about, and how on the right flank stood, as if rooted to the ground, 3 regiments: Preobrazhensky, Lefortovsky, and Semyonovsky. A bullet pierced my leg. Load! Fire!
Fire!
The Swede stopped. Second volley! Blood was already squelching in his shoes. A second bullet tore through the coat, striking the shoulder. The battle was already lost, but they held on, standing literally knee-deep in blood. Yesterday's toy soldiers, the future guards of the Russian army. Later, in memory of this, red stockings would be incorporated into the uniforms of the guards' regiments. But then, at Narva, out of the entire encircled Russian army, King Charles allowed only these 3 regiments to leave the camp with weapons and banners, to the beat of drums, out of respect for their immense courage and their tireless fighting skills. Peter met the remnants of his army in Novgorod. Stretched out along the entire road, unarmed, ragged soldiers trudged through the mud. His army was no more. Suddenly, the cold silence was broken by a distant drumbeat, in blood-stained uniforms. Struggling to maintain their thinned ranks, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments marched in formation, with weapons and banners, his strong, undefeated God. And Peter understood what needed to be done. Now the entire Russian army must become such a guard. This will be a new army, one that can fight any enemy, under any circumstances, without ever relying on anyone's help at all. And win. The events at Narva showed that the Russian army lacked not only experience and training, but also discipline. Desertion, and especially treason, had to be prevented very harshly. Peter was especially wrathful and ruthless towards officers who dared to defect.
Peter introduced discipline in the Russian army, regulated by military statutes. Violations were subject to a system of punishments, ranging from arrest and flogging with rods to the death penalty for treason. For theft, a shameful brand was burned onto the face. Cowardice and desertion were punishable by hanging. For blasphemy against the sovereign and commanders, as well as looting, the punishment was beheading or quartering. The final version of the charter was published in the year 1716. Later, even when deciding criminal cases, it was often Peter the Great's military charter that was referred to.
By the time of Peter's reign, military affairs in Europe had changed significantly. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery operated in battle as a single mechanism. Commanders were required to know tactics, topography, and mathematics, and soldiers were required to display discipline and military skills which were achieved through training and education. Russia needed an army that was not just large, but one that was regular and professional, and capable of defending the country at any given moment.
Peter began its creation using the experience of the foreign formation regiments and former toy regiments. He announced the recruitment of volunteers for military service with pay, and he also regularized conscription, drafting serfs, one recruit from every few dozen households, To prevent conscripts from running away, they were immediately shackled. A recruit mark was tattooed on the left arm, a gunpowder cross. If a recruit ran away, he couldn't return home, and the peasants of his community had to provide a new person. The age of conscripts ranged from 20 to 35 years. Military service was declared lifelong, and relatives mourned conscripts as if they were dead. Thus, 29 infantry, as well as 2 dragoon cavalry regiments, were formed, making an overall total of 32,000 men.
Passing by the parade ground, Peter Alexeyevich stopped. Major of the Guard Mikhail Golitsyn, sparing no effort, was struggling with the newly recruited soldiers. It was painful to watch.
March!
The village boys didn't know how to march in formation.
I said left.
In addition,
Left!
no one knew how to handle equipment and weapons, and they were terrified of the officer.
Left! Move!
Golitsyn's
I said
voice
left.
was hoarse from giving commands, but it was all in vain.
Left!
The recruits
Keep the
didn't understand a
formation.
variety of concepts, including march right and march left.
Hay on the left, straw on the right.
After some thought, Peter ordered a bundle of hay to be tied to each recruit's left leg, and a bundle of straw to the right. And when on the parade ground, instead of the usual left-right, they heard hay straw. Hay straw. Things immediately started to improve.
Hey! Straw! Hey! Straw! Hey! Straw!
And Peter, who was in high spirits, continued on his way. Now it was time to create their own officer corps. A Russian one. Peter sent letters to all of the governors
made of all nobles.
to compile a list of
Sons
nobles
fit
and
for
their
service.
children. From these, the Tsar chose those fit for service and personally assigned them to regiments. Peter's messengers rushed to all corners of Russia.
In 88 cities, the authorities deemed a whopping 11,147 landowners fit for service. All of the remaining nobles were ordered to stay ready and report for duty at the very first call.
The rank of officer implied not only noble birth, but also extensive knowledge. Initially, Peter sent young people to study abroad, but he soon established special officer schools, including artillery and engineering ones where mathematics, ballistics, topography, and tactics were taught. For the first time in Russia, military education emerged. Just a year after Narva, there were no foreigners at all among the officers of the Semyonovsky regiment. And there were only 3 in the Preobrazhensky regiment. Amazingly, 206 Russian noble officers were sent to General Sheremetev's troops alone. Whenever he could spare even an hour, Peter would come to the German quarter, to his Anushka, in the large, beautiful house he had given her. Home comfort, delicious food, and the radiant eyes of his beloved. What else does a tired soldier need? Peter loved for Anna to greet him in the old Russian tradition, with a shot of vodka, a small pie, and a kiss. He also loved boisterous feasts, rowdy behavior, crude jokes, drunken soldiers. But she longed for beauty, tenderness, flowers. Well, if it's flowers she wants, flowers it is. Danilich, quick! Menshikov, as always, turned around in the blink of an eye. The flowers seemed vaguely familiar to Anna, because they had simply been torn from her own flower bed. Peter didn't bother with such trifles. He was engrossed in the new armament for the infantry. and everything else could wait.
The infantry formed the backbone of the army. The infantry formation was protected from cavalry attacks by pikemen with long pikes pointed at the enemy. Over time, rifles with long fixed bayonets came to replace pikes. Ammunition was stored in pouches, a round bullet and a portion of powder that was wrapped in a paper cartridge. Following orders, the soldier would bite off the paper and pour some powder into the pan of the gun lock. The rest of the powder was poured into the barrel, where the bullet was also inserted, ramming the charge with a ramrod. The first rank would fire simultaneously and then fall back. The second rank would then move forward and fire the next volley. On average, reloading in battle took a unit 20 to 30 seconds, and this allowed for 2 to 3 shots per minute. Only well-trained soldiers could achieve such firing speed, and sometimes even a greater speed than that. Thus, during battle, a continuous barrage of rifle fire would rain down on the enemy along the entire front. At that time, this was considered the most advanced and effective method of combat.
Present arms!
1, 2, 3!
The training introduced by Peter bore fruit. The Turks and Persians believed that the Russians shot directly from their fingers, and therefore after battles they examined the hands of the dead, wondering if they were human. Of all the military branches, Peter particularly favored artillery. That's why the artillerymen of the Semyonovsky regiment prepared especially meticulously for the Tsar's review. The Tsar had begun his military service in the Bombardier Company. Since then, he enjoyed conducting firing exercises himself.
Catch the cannonball!
Once, during a misfire, he nearly lost his eyesight and his life. But this didn't dampen his enthusiasm for artillery. Peter studied cannon aiming techniques, gunpowder properties, and the design of guns and gun carriages. In the year 1697, after completing an artillery course in Königsberg, he received a certificate stating that Peter may be recognized everywhere as a very competent, careful, skillful, and fearless firearms master and artisan. Since then, the Tsar insisted on being addressed as nothing less than Mr. Bombardier, and he sometimes signed his letters as Bom, Bar, Deer in 3 syllables. Upon returning to Moscow, Peter went straight to Anushka's place. He intentionally didn't announce his arrival. It was a surprise. A voice was heard behind the door, male and unfamiliar. They were speaking German. Now that's truly a surprise. Franz Koenigsegg, envoy of the Polish King Augustus, a former ally. Is our brother Augustus in good health? He's well, Koenigsegg assured, but quite distressed about the lack of funds for the war against Charles of Sweden. Not enough, you say? Peter interrupted him.
Looks like it
seems all the funds went into this construction. I drink to the health of my brother Augustus.
To the king's health. To our brother Augustus.
Oh, your majesty, Koenigsegg stammered.
To Augustus! The affections of the young
This
goddess,
is merely a
whose
humble
beauty is
offering to
beyond
the young
compare.
goddess, whose incomparable beauty will
All
go
right.
on. To the health of my brother Augustus.
Drink to the health of our brother Augustus. Bottoms up!
Look how he is drunk.
Come on,
Koenigsegg
guys.
didn't last even an hour.
Come here, big boy.
Watch out, gentlemen. It seems this fellow is in dire need of a long nap.
It's all right, he'll come around. He'll think twice before bringing bouquets again. Two long years had passed since the defeat at Narva. But Peter's determination to reclaim access to the Baltic from the Swedes only grew stronger. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he thought how to get it. Before marching on Narva, it was decided to capture the fortress of Notburg. This fortress stood on an island at the mouth of the Neva River, and its capture would allow the use of the river for transporting goods and supplying the Russian army. For 2 weeks, Russian artillery bombarded Notburg. Finally, a section of the eastern wall collapsed. After crossing the river, the Russians tried to storm the fortress through this breach, but the siege ladders turned out to be too short. The Swedes pelted the Russians with grenades, and so the assault came to a halt. Standing on the cape near the silent battery, Peter watched the chaotic melee at the walls. "Well," he said, "it is time for the guards." Lieutenant Colonel Mikhailo Golitsyn, having received the order, rushed to the shore. His Semyonovsky men, bending their oars, flew in boats towards the fortress, to certain death. Upon landing, Golitsyn led his men, running into the assault. The soldiers stubbornly climbed the walls under a barrage of grape-shot grenades and stones, but did not advance even an inch. In the 6th hour of the battle, Peter could not bear it anymore and sent an order. "Do not waste lives, retreat." The messenger brought Golitsyn's reply. "Now I belong not to you, sire, but to God alone." Peter managed to see how stubborn Mishka was, pushing boats into the river, so that no one would be tempted by the opportunity to retreat. It was the madness of the brave, outright suicide. But Menshikov caught Golitsyn's boats, put his reserve on them, and without waiting for orders, went to the rescue. After 12 hours of assault, Notburg finally raised the white flag. This ancient Russian fortress on Orakovi Island was called Oreshek, before it was captured by the Swedes. Peter ordered it to be named Schlisselburg, the key city. This victory was indeed crucial, and it allowed them, a few months later, to capture the fortress of Nyenschans, 50 kilometers from Schlisselburg, where the new capital of the Russian Empire, the city of St. Petersburg, was founded.
As time went on, Schlisselburg indeed became a kind of key to the northern capital. In the year 1941, the capture of this city by German troops marked the beginning of the siege of Leningrad, a siege which lasted 872 days. The Oreshek fortress itself on the island resisted for 500 days, never allowing the enemy to cross to the right bank of the Neva and cut off the road of life. Only the liberation of Schlisselburg in the year 1943 first allowed for improved supplies to the northern capital, and then completely lifted the siege.
Mikhailo Golitsyn survived by a miracle. And as soon as he recovered from his wounds, Peter promoted him to colonel. All surviving Semyonovsky Regiment soldiers were generously rewarded, and now they greeted the Tsar with a drumbeat, standing under their regimental banner.
By Peter's decree, each and every military unit had a banner. Company banners were colored cloths with an eagle, while the regimental banner was white. Abandoning the banner in battle was punishable by death. If after a battle only a few men remained from the entire regiment, but the banner survived, the regiment continued to exist and was rebuilt anew.
Peter managed to break away from the front and come home for just a couple of days. The first thing he did was visit his Anushka. He had missed her terribly. He sent away his entourage. He wanted to finally be alone with his beloved without all that crowd of loyal drunks and troublemakers. But it seemed no one was expecting him here. So that's how it is. While his loyal drunks and troublemakers were standing by him to the death, the woman he loved and trusted most had betrayed him. Simply and casually. And now he had to learn to live with this. The next day, Koenigsegg was found in the Narva, in the shallowest part of the water. Apparently, he slipped on a stone while drunk and hit his head. Anna Mons was stripped of any and all privileges and property which had been given to her by the Tsar. She was placed under house arrest, and only after 2 years, following numerous requests, was she allowed to go to the Lutheran church once a week. Almost 4 years had passed since the disaster at Narva. Peter was approaching his main goal, to finally clear the Baltic shores of the Swedes. The fortress of Narva, where it all began, remained one of the enemy's last strongholds. In the summer of 1704, the Russian army besieged Narva for the second time. Astoundingly, the Russian forces outnumbered the garrison by almost 10 to 1. Narva's fortifications were virtually impregnable. Moreover, there was a rumor that General Schlippenbach's 7,000-strong corps was coming to aid the fortress. And then Peter had an idea. All night long, Swedish uniforms were being sewn from blue cloth in the regimental tailoring shops. Peter was rushing around the camp in feverish excitement, explaining nothing to anyone. The soldiers were ordered to replace their live ammunition with blanks, put on blue uniforms, and move to the nearest grove. The Tsar himself dressed up as a Swedish general for some reason. He clearly had something in mind, and was very pleased with himself. Arvid Horn, the commandant of Narva, watched the Russians form their battle lines. Schlippenbach must be the cause of this commotion. Neat rows in blue uniforms appeared, the Swedes. Horn sent a detachment to help them, to catch the Russians in a pincer movement. Suddenly, a strange sight met the commandant's eyes. The detachment he had sent was fleeing back in panic, trying to escape from Schlippenbach's troops. Confused, Horn caught sight of the general himself through his spyglass, and was horrified to recognize Tsar Peter in a Swedish uniform. Imposters. That night, the Russian generals led by Peter had a great time recalling how Menshikov, commanding the fake battle, nearly fell off his horse from laughter. And the looks on the Swedes' faces when they discovered this masquerade.
Hooray! Hooray!
However, they had to admit that the maneuver had failed. They couldn't storm into Narva by brute force. A proper siege had to be initiated. For 2 months, Russian cannons bombarded the fortress. In Narva, fires raged on and famine set in. But when offered to surrender, Commandant Horn responded with an insult. Peter ordered the assault to begin. The Narva garrison fought with fierce determination. And just as the Russians managed to climb the rampart, the Swedes detonated a mine, killing both friend and foe alike. When blood-stained stones stopped raining from the sky, the Russians stormed the city in such a bestial rage that no one was spared. The screams were deafening. The officers couldn't control their frenzied soldiers. Peter entered the city on horseback, as befits a conqueror. The first thing he saw upon entering was a Russian soldier who was dragging a woman by her hair. In a fit of rage, the Tsar drew his broadsword and cut down the marauder in front of everyone. The rampage came to an abrupt end. They barely managed to rescue Commandant Horn from the hands of the enraged soldiers and take him prisoner along with the remnants of his garrison. 4 years after their first defeat at Narva, the Russian army had their revenge, and now they were heading to winter quarters. Temporary houses were built for the regiment, or soldiers were billeted with local residents. According to regulations, 1 bed was required for every 3 men, assuming 2 would sleep on it, while the 3rd was on guard duty.
A private was entitled to daily rations of 400 grams of meat, mutton or beef, 800 grams of rye bread, 2 shots of wine or vodka, and about a liter of beer. Additionally, each person was allotted 350 kilograms of flour, 160 kilograms of buckwheat or oat groats, and 11 kilograms of salt per year.
Every day, Peter personally approved the daily ration. Afterwards, for a month, he ate only soldiers' food, not allowing himself the slightest indulgence. However, during marches, food convoys were often delayed. Sometimes, due to corrupt quartermasters, the food arrived spoiled. During times of hunger, soldiers resorted not only to hardtack, but also to stealing from locals. Despite extremely harsh punishments, a soldier would never miss even the slightest chance to steal a goose, chicken, or other livestock from an unsuspecting local.
Military pay was quite decent at the time, although unfortunately, payments were often delayed. The subsistence minimum was 2 rubles per year. This amount of money was enough to buy 80 kilograms of wheat flour, 40 kilograms of beef, or 80 kilograms of herring. A colonel received 300 rubles a year, a captain 100, and a private 24, half of which was deducted for uniforms. The troops were supplied with all necessities according to standard patterns, and uniforms were regulated down to the smallest detail. A private was issued: a felt tricorn hat, a long single-breasted cloth coat, green for infantry, blue for dragoons, red for artillerymen, a waistcoat, knee-length breeches and 2 pairs of stockings, a necktie, 2 pairs of footwear, low shoes for marching, boots for guard duty, high boots with spurs for dragoons, and 2 sets of underwear. In winter, a woolen cloak called yapancha was worn.
Army supply contracts were always a lucrative opportunity for merchants and manufacturers. The production of weapons, ammunition, and uniforms brought considerable profit and remained a subject of bribery and theft worldwide. Peter had a habit of feeling the cloth of soldiers' uniforms and cloaks and inspecting their shoes. If they turned out to be of poor quality, the full force of the Tsar's fury would be unleashed on the pitiable culprit. Peter ruthlessly sent those caught stealing to frozen Siberia, slit their nostrils, or simply hanged them if the value of the stolen goods happened to exceed the price of the rope.
Medicine was also regulated in army life. Regimental doctors were issued monastery bags with a set of tools and supplies. Knives, saws, tourniquets, splints, waxed threads, needles, syringes, and lint, a precursor to cotton wool made from cotton threads. The doctors were usually foreigners. They rarely dealt with treating infectious diseases or preventing epidemics, considering their main tasks to be removing bullets and shrapnel, treating wounds, and amputating limbs. However, the most common diseases in the army were actually intestinal infections of various types. At times, these diseases could decimate up to half of the troops.
One day, Menshikov invited the Tsar to come and visit his field quarters. He must have wanted something, it seems. A new housekeeper was serving them at the table. Peter became interested. Who is she? A captive from Marienburg, Menshikov explained. Her name is Martha Katharina, widow of Officer Johann Kruse. He was saying something else, but Peter was no longer listening to him. It was as if the housekeeper had cast a spell on him. Listen here, Katya. I'm staying the night. In the evening, bring me a candle to my bedchamber. I will, Martha Katharina replied quietly. In the morning, Peter left, and the very next day, his orderly came and took the officer's widow, Martha Katharina Kruse, with all her belongings, to the Tsar for good. By the year 1704, the Russian army had recaptured almost the entire southern coast of the Baltic Sea from the Swedes. Peter's strategic objective seemed to have been accomplished. St. Petersburg was being built at the mouth of the Neva River. Piers, ports, military and merchant ships were being constructed. At long last, Russia was preparing to join global trade. And its army made it abundantly clear that there would be absolutely no colonies on Russian soil. Neither Peter nor his generals had the slightest inkling that the greatest test for the army and for the entire country was yet to come. The loss of the Baltic coast forced the Swedish king, Charles XII, to turn his full attention to events occurring in the east. The commander, who had already defeated all of Tsar Peter's allies, decided it was finally time to deal with the Russian problem as well. In June of the year 1708, shocking news reached St. Petersburg. Charles was marching towards Moscow, and he was leading his entire army. The very existence of the Russian state was under threat, and Peter understood this better than anyone else. It's one thing to capture individual fortresses, but quite another to face the main forces of the world's best army. Fortifications were being hastily erected on the western border. Moscow was also preparing for defense. The walls of Zemlyanoy Gorod, Kitai-Gorod, and the Kremlin were being repaired, where 2,000 cannons were installed. Russian diplomats tried their hardest to achieve at least a truce, but Charles wouldn't even hear of it. In July of the year 1708, his troops approached the town of Golovchino, near Mogilev. Moscow was less than 600 kilometers away. A letter arrived from Moscow from Catherine Vasilevskaya. That's what his Martha Katharina was called now. Peter became alarmed. How could this be? He had ordered Katerina to be taken out of the city to a safe place. Who dared to disobey? To my sovereign, my light, my joy, may you live for many years. But I will not follow your order. Forgive me. Better allow me to come to you wherever you may be. And if that's not possible, I'll wait for you here. I am with you forever. Where you are, there I am. I remain your devoted servant, Katerina Vasilevskaya. From intelligence reports, Peter knew that the Swedish army was experiencing major supply problems after its endlessly long march, and that a huge convoy with food and ammunition had set out from Riga to meet Charles XII's army. And he also knew the convoy was accompanied by General Lewenhaupt's corps. Peter made a decision. He would find and attack Lewenhaupt and intercept the convoy. The battle was long. Soldiers on both sides were so tired that they sat down to rest, right on the battlefield. But the incredible happened. For the very first time in open battle, the Russians defeated the Swedes, who outnumbered them. Barely catching his breath after the battle, Mikhailo Golitsyn arrived at Peter's quarters. Peter immediately awarded him the rank of lieutenant general. "You've earned it, Mishka." Now they fought together side by side, with Peter being lower in rank, so that if necessary, Peter could serve under Golitsyn's command. And he didn't consider it shameful in the least. The victory at Lesnaya became the turning point of the entire war. The Russians captured a huge convoy with food, uniforms, and ammunition. This convoy was supposed to support the Swedish advance on Moscow, but now it wouldn't. This forced Charles to halt his advance towards the Russian capital. He had no choice but to turn towards Ukraine to wait out the winter. He was moving towards the small Ukrainian town of Poltava, where the outcome of the war was to be decided. Everyone was in their positions. The cavalry commander, General Alexander Menshikov. The artillery commander, Lieutenant General Jacob Bruce. The commander of the Army Center, General Anikita Repnin. The commander of the guards, Lieutenant General Mikhail Golitsyn. They had traveled this entire journey with him, from the village of Preobrazhenskoye all the way to Poltava. And now they were ready to die for him, as was the entire vast army from general to private. And Peter said to his comrades in arms, "Do, brothers, as I will do, and all with the help of the Almighty shall be well." Silence hung over the ranks, with only the banners whistling in the wind. Suddenly the Tsar raised his voice. And so you must not think
you fight
that you are fighting for Peter
himself,
but for the state that was entrusted to Peter. The battle began before dawn, at 2 o'clock in the morning. Menshikov's cavalry charged into battle. Bruce's artillery showered the Swedish infantry with grape shot. Repnin held the center of the front with his very last ounce of strength. The Swedes rolled forward like an iron wave, and the Russians began to retreat. On the verge of a breakthrough, Peter appeared before the infantry lines. As he watched, the battalion flag on the left flank wavered and tilted. Under a hail of rifle fire, the Tsar galloped along the entire formation. The infantry closed ranks and advanced. The flag straightened. The bullet-riddled ensign, as he fell, managed to plant the flagpole deep into the ground and held it with the weight of his body. At this moment, Golitsyn's guards crushed the enemy's left flank. The Swedes faltered and fled. By noon, the battle was over. The Swedish army ceased to be the strongest military force in Europe. It was defeated by an army that no one had heard of, just yesterday. Years and centuries would pass. The Russian army would expand Russia's borders from the Baltic to the Black Sea, defeat Napoleon, and enter Paris in the year 1814. And in 1945, it would defeat Hitler and raise its flag over the Reichstag. The Battle of Poltava would become but the first in that list of great victories. From Poltava, Peter immediately set off for the village of Kolomenskoye near Moscow, where his beloved, his unwed wife Catherine, was waiting for him. She was simply radiant with happiness. The comfort of home, delicious food, and the beaming eyes of his beloved. What more could a weary soldier ask for?